My name is Rick Just. The following is a video version of a presentation I give occasionally to interested groups. It's an introduction to the Morrisite War of 1862, and particularly how it affected my great-grandparents and their parents, all of whom were Morrisites. It includes some material unrelated to the Morrisites that should be of interest to those who enjoy pioneer history. The presentation relies heavily on the books Joseph Morris and the Saga of the Morrisites Revisited by Dr. C. Leroy Anderson and Letters of Long Ago by Agnes Just Reed. Both are readily available on Amazon. The Prophet. In 1857, Joseph Morris, an English convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, reported receiving revelations naming him the seventh angel from the book of Revelation. He wrote to Brigham Young, seeking recognition of his calling. The LDS leader was unimpressed, though Morris had offered Brigham Young the position of right-hand man to the new prophet. Morris pestered Brigham Young with revelation after revelation, hand-scrawled and delivered to the church leader. Each revelation was becoming increasingly persistent. Brigham Young was equally persistent in his silence. In all, Morris had more than 300 revelations. It seems he had long given thought to religion. His older brother George wrote this about him, referring to the time when both still lived in England in the 1840s. He was very zealous, and soon obtained the gift of tongues so thoroughly that it was said that he could speak 7 different languages. He had the misfortune to get burned very severely 2 times while working in the coal mines by explosions of the fire damp, which affected his mind a good deal, and he became very enthusiastic on religious matters. The fire damp, by the way, is the name given to mine gases such as methane that could be set off by a spark. To give you a peek into the mind of Joseph Morris, I'd like to read you what was written on his ornate staff. These are a couple of photos of sections of the staff, which is in the possession of a museum in Utah nowadays. The description on the staff reads, "To all nations and people of all languages that now dwell upon the earth. Be it known unto you that I am sent by the great King of kings and Lord of lords to rule over all Adam's posterity, and being his representative, I hold in my hand this emblem of power, unto which all nations and kingdoms of the earth shall bow. I am the legitimate ruler over all the earth, and my authority is sanctioned by the first God. Therefore I hold in my hand an emblem of power to represent his scepter, which will shortly be given unto me. I am Joseph Morris, president of the Melchizedek priesthood." Well, clearly, you couldn't just make up something like that, so this had to be the real deal. In 1860, Morris began to collect his own followers, people more believing in his revelations than Brigham Young was. Among them were both sets of my great-great-grandparents, Peter Anderson Just and his wife, Karen Marie. My other great-great-grandparents were George and Frances Thompson. That's George in the buggy with 2 women, neither of which is his wife, Frances. They are his wives, Kate and Jane. But he wasn't a polygamist. Jane was his second wife following the death of Frances, which we'll talk about later. Jane also died, so he married Kate, whom he would also outlive. He had his eyes on a 4th wife, but that didn't work out. Morris's followers would become known as the Morrisites. Many were recruits from Europe, especially from Denmark and England, who opposed polygamy. The Justs were from Denmark, and the Thompsons were from England. Some Morrisites, especially the Danes, who had little English, had not understood that polygamy was a practice of the LDS Church at the time they signed up. Other than the prohibition on polygamy, a belief in reincarnation, and the belief that Jesus was coming back to earth very, very soon, the religion was similar to that of the Latter-day Saints. On April 6, 1861, Morris organized his Church of the Firstborn and called all of his followers to gather at Kington Fort, a 3-acre site on the Weber River, today called South Weber. It had been a military post for 4 or 5 years, but had been abandoned in 1858 when Indian hostilities proved not forthcoming. By fall 1861, Morris had several hundred followers. Morris told the faithful that the second coming was imminent, and not to bother with planting crops. The group pooled available supplies and confidently waited at Kington Fort for their Savior. By spring 1862, food was scarce, and some members were becoming discontented. Morris repeatedly designated certain days for the second coming, only to have those days pass uneventfully. Each time this happened, some members would recover their possessions from the community pool and leave the congregation. 3 departing members were unhappy with what they got back from the commune and vowed revenge. They seized a load of wheat en route from Kington to Kaysville for milling. The Morrisites sent a group of men after them, and the group soon captured the 3 and the purloined wheat. The church held the men prisoner in a small cabin to be, quote, tried by the Lord when he came. The Morrisite War. One prisoner soon escaped, but the other men's wives petitioned the territorial government for assistance in getting their release. Word reached John F. Kinney, Chief Justice of Utah Territory, that the Morrisites were illegally holding prisoners. On May 24th, he issued a writ of habeas corpus commanding their release. U.S. Marshal Judson Stoddard brought the writ to Kington Fort and read it to the Morrisite leaders, who refused to receive it. After the Morrisites dishonored a similar writ 3 weeks later, Chief Justice Kinney asked the acting governor to activate the territorial militia as a posse comitatus to arrest the Morrisite leaders. On June 12, 1862, a 200-man armed posse departed Salt Lake City for the fort 30 miles north. Robert T. Burton, Deputy U.S. Marshal, led the posse, which gathered strength along the way and was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 strong when it reached the settlement on June 13th. The posse positioned itself on bluffs southwest of the fort, with contingents on the flats to the east and the west. They situated cannons on 2 small ridges looking directly into the fort, which was really a makeshift enclosure of native rock walls, tying together a series of cabins. Another militia from Ogden positioned itself to the north. Burton sent a message via a Morrisite herd boy requesting the group's surrender within 30 minutes. As soon as he received the message, Morris left his associates to be alone. He soon returned with a new revelation, promising his people the posse would be destroyed. He and his counselors had a bugle sounded to gather the congregation. The Morrisites, many of them wearing white robes, were gathered beneath a brush arbor, listening to the reading of the order, when someone in the militia fired a cannon, perhaps intended as a warning. The cannonball hit the dirt inside the fort and bounced into the arbor, killing 2 women, one elderly, and the other a young woman holding a baby in her arms. The same cannonball struck 16-year-old Mary Christopherson in the face, shattering her jaw. Keep her in the back of your mind because we'll hear from her again later. The fort, which was poorly built in the first place, sat in the bottom of a bowl with bluffs surrounding 3 sides, making it easy for the Mormon militia to see inside and fire at will. Following the cannon shot, the militia and the Morrisites exchanged fire. That first day of the siege, one member of the militia, a young man named Jared Smith, rose up to see the effect of his shot and was himself shot and killed by a Morrisite bullet. The siege of Kington Fort would last 3 days. At times, there was a bit of a holiday air about the whole thing, with local residents finding good viewing spots on the surrounding hills where they could watch the spectacle unfold. Meanwhile, the Morrisites were nearly out of food and ammunition. This might have discouraged other people in such a situation, but Joseph Morris assured his followers that they were merely being tested by God, who would step in when things seemed to be at their worst. That Sunday morning, June 15th, 1862, God had told Morris as much in what would be the final revelation the man would receive. So even though they were hungry, exhausted, and being fired on relentlessly, all those things were good signs for a while. That Sunday afternoon, militia members began attacking in earnest. They rolled the protective battery up against the walls of the fort and began breaking into cabins on the west side. A second militia member was killed during that forced entry. The Morrisites on the west began running across the fort in a panic. Some of them may have thought the battery that was now up against the wall was filled with explosives. In any case, it became clear to those in the fort that their worst moment had come, and that Jesus had not. Late on the afternoon of the 15th, the bugler began playing "A Cottage by the Woods," the gathering song of the Morrisites. They did gather, and they raised the white flag of surrender. Burton and some of his men galloped into the fort on horseback, ordering the Morrisites to stack their arms. They immediately did so. Burton called Morris and his leading men forward and is quoted as saying, "I want no more of your apostasy." It is at this point where things get most confusing, and where the stories diverge depending on whether the teller was a member of the militia or the Morrisites. A few days after the surrender, Colonel Burton described what happened thusly. "I placed some men to take charge of the arms or guard them. Then Mr. Morris made some remarks and asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted all the men who had taken up arms against me. Then Morris said to the crowd, 'All who will stand by me to the death, lift up their hands.' And all, as far as I could see, lifted up their hands and made a push as though they were going to the schoolhouse or some place to defend themselves. I ordered Morris to stop, and followed him up. I had no arms but my revolver, and as he would not stop, I stopped him with my revolver. He was shot dead. Banks was also shot through the neck, from which wound he died. 2 women were shot at the same time, which I very much regret, but it could not be helped." The Morrisites told a little different version that put Burton as a bit more of the aggressor. "Whatever happened, it is indisputable that Joseph Morris and several of his followers were killed. It is at this point where my great-grandmother, 13-year-old Emma Thompson, takes up the story. Quoting her, "We Morrisites thought that none of our number who were faithful could be killed. Even when Morris was shot and fell lifeless to the ground, we did not think him dead. I saw the wadding fly back from his clothes, and thought it was the bullets rebounding from him. We considered him invulnerable, or that if he should be killed, he would be immediately restored to life. When Morris was killed, my father sat upon his body, saying, 'Now kill me, for I have nothing more to live for.'" Fortunately, when Burton aimed his pistol at my great-great-grandfather, the gun misfired, giving other Morrisites the opportunity to drag George Thompson away. Burton and his militia rounded up the Morrisites, separating the men from the women. They marched 90 men to Salt Lake City. Many were charged with resisting due process, and some were charged with second-degree murder. The bodies of Joseph Morris and his second-in-command, John Banks, were taken to Salt Lake City and put on display at City Hall. Morris's robe, his staff, and other implements of his office were displayed with him in mockery. Exile. Timing is everything in life, and the destitute Morrisites were the recipients of some very good luck in this regard. 66 of them were convicted of resistance and fined $100 each. 7 were convicted of second-degree murder. To their good fortune, in July of 1862, the political winds took a sudden turn. A new governor had been appointed to oversee Utah Territory. Within 3 days of their conviction, the Morrisites received a pardon from new territorial governor Stephen S. Harding, who was no fan of Brigham Young. Not just the governor had changed. The military presence changed considerably with the arrival of the California Volunteers, a U.S. Army regiment under the command of Colonel Patrick E. Connor. This secular contingent effectively overshadowed the loosely organized volunteers that had made up the Mormon militia. Governor Harding's pardon was an outrage to many Mormons, so it seemed wise to move the Morrisites out of Salt Lake, and quickly. Many of the Morrisites left Utah Territory under military escort for Carson City, Nevada. About 160 others were escorted by Colonel Connor's troops to the Bear River Valley in the newly formed Idaho Territory. It is from that latter group that I descend, so it is that story that I'll tell. The Morrisites left Salt Lake on May 5, 1863, intent on forming a new community in Idaho Territory, which was itself only a few weeks old. While our family cannot help but be grateful to Colonel Connor and his troops for their protection, it gives me pause to realize that the very day that ragtag caravan of Morrisites entered Idaho Territory for the first time, they passed within a couple of miles of the site of what many believe was the worst Indian massacre in U.S. history, perpetrated by that same colonel and some of those same troops just a few weeks earlier in the name of making the country safer for settlers. On January 29, 1863, Colonel Connor's soldiers attacked a Shoshone winter camp on the banks of the Bear River. Perhaps as many as 500 men, women, and children died on that awful day when temperatures were 20 below zero as they stumbled through the icy waters trying to get away. The Shoshone tribe would never be a threat to settlers again if they ever truly were. So, my forefathers walked and rode up through the Bear River Valley in temperatures far more inviting, probably hearing stories of the battle from the soldiers who rode along with them. The Morrisites arrived at their destination, a famous mineral springs along the Oregon Trail, 150 miles north of Salt Lake City, on May 20th, 1863. There, the soldiers established a post that would be called Fort Connor, after their commander. The 200-acre Morrisite settlement was named after their martyred leader. It was called Morristown. Morristown survived for several years, but was ultimately subsumed by a later Mormon settlement that is known today as Soda Springs. One interesting side note is that the first log cabin built in Soda Springs was a summer home for Brigham Young. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in 1944 in an unsuccessful attempt to move it. Morristown was located in the flats below the bluff that was the site of Camp Connor. Today, most of the town site is under the water of Anderson Reservoir. The barn you see in the picture marks what remains of the site. It is a Morrisite barn built by the Anderson family, but it was moved to the site years after the town was abandoned. The Morrisite War was, in a real sense, a battle of theology, putting down dissension among the faithful. The Church of the Firstborn was not destroyed when its charismatic leader was killed, but it was mortally wounded. It would take about 100 years for the church itself to die. The National Park Service interpretive sign, shown here, tells the story of the Morrisite settlement. Now stand by for a little irony. This sign and two others are located on the edge of a parking lot overlooking the site of Camp Connor and the Morristown site below that. The Morristown site is owned by Rocky Mountain Power, the company that operates the reservoir. The Camp Connor site is now a grassy ball field. The parking lot above that, where the interpretive signs are located, belongs to a local Mormon church. In every sense, the Mormons won the war with the Morrisites. For many years, the church disavowed the historical fact of the Morrisite War. My great-aunt's book, Letters of Long Ago, which contains a couple of references to it, was routinely lost in libraries around the West. To their credit, though, the church now not only recognizes this sad note in their history, in our history, but it is even keeping it alive. The NPS signs in that church parking lot are one indication of that. This monument in South Weber is another. It gives a pretty accurate overview of the Morrisite War without assigning blame to either side. It was put up by the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers. Another indication that the church is embracing its history is the third edition of Agnes Just Reed's book, published by the University of Utah Press in 1973, and edited by well-known LDS historian Brigham D. Madsen. It includes extensive endnotes about the Morrisite War written by Dr. Madsen. In the fourth edition of the book, published by the Presto Preservation Association, our family foundation, we have kept all those endnotes and included some additional information of interest. This program is primarily about the Morrisite War, but I can't end it here with the founding of Morristown. I'm going to take just a few more minutes to fill in the story of Emma Thompson, taking it up to 1887. Emma was a teenager at Morristown, though that term, teenager, was yet to be invented. Her memories about those days were full of community dances and handsome soldiers. She would marry one in February 1865, a month after her 15th birthday. But she wasn't the first of the Morrisites to marry. That honor went to Mary Christopherson, the young woman who lost her jaw when that first cannon shot was fired into Kington Fort. She became Mary Anderson in July 1863. That probably qualifies her as the first woman settler married in Idaho Territory. The scoundrel soldier. So back to Emma. Emma Thompson married 28-year-old George Waldron Bennett, a supply sergeant. We don't know for sure if this is a picture of George. It's a tintype showing what seems to be a military man of about the right age, and it was among the possessions of Emma passed down through her family. In any case, George Bennett was an Englishman who had traveled extensively, and his father was a well-known actor and playwright at the time in England. In his blue uniform with brass buttons, he must have been a dashing figure to the young girl who had known little but dirt floors and hard work to that point. Early on in their marriage, though, there was a hint of trouble. The Army moved George Bennett and his new wife to Fort Douglas, Utah, where he worked in the commissary. The commissary burned down, and Sergeant Bennett was suspected to have caused the fire. He was thrown into the guardhouse along with another man. This left 15-year-old Emma alone and frightened about what would happen to her. After a few days, she worked up the courage to go inquire about George's fate. It was Post Commander Patrick Connor she went to see. By that time, he was Brigadier General Connor, and a very imposing figure. Emma pleaded for mercy for her husband. At some point, General Connor expressed his surprise by saying, "Why, my child? You are married?" He ended their meeting with the words, "We'll see what we can do about it." George Bennett was released the next day and soon was mustered out of the Army. Emma and George first moved back to Morristown, then to Taylor Bridge, a toll bridge and stage stop that would shortly become a small town called Eagle Rock, which would eventually become the city of Idaho Falls. In the winter of 1866 and 1867, Emma was the only white woman living there. She and George ran the bridge and took care of livestock. In the fall of 1867, Emma's parents, who were still at Morristown, decided they'd had enough of this rugged land and would move back to England. They had lost a younger daughter that winter, and Emma's mother, Frances, who we do not have a picture of, was despondent. She just wanted to go home. She also wanted Emma and her husband to go with them. So Emma and George set out for Helena, Montana, where they were to meet up with the Thompsons and take a steamer down the Missouri to the Mississippi and on to New Orleans, where they would catch a ship back to England. By this time, Emma was pregnant. She spent most of her time at a little miner's cabin they rented on the outskirts of Helena. Emma didn't want to go into town because Helena was teeming with rough-and-tumble miners, half of them drunk at any given time. So George would dutifully go into town every day to see if Emma's parents had shown up. Every day he would come back and report that they had not. Finally, the last steamer of the season left Helena. Emma could not understand why her parents had not shown up as planned. It was only later, too late, that she found they had indeed arrived in Helena. They'd camped in the middle of the street so they could not be missed. George, who secretly had no desire to go back to England, had gone into town each day, only to watch them and stay hidden himself until the day they left. It was a cruel blow to Emma, made even more devastating when she later learned that her mother and a newborn sister had both died when they arrived in England, before they even reached their home. George's betrayal was not to be his last bad deed. He found a good job working in a livery in Deer Lodge, Montana. He had little money to spend, and he spent most of it on drink, often ignoring his pregnant wife. One night he stole money and a horse from his employer and rode away. He was soon overtaken and brought back to jail. Emma moved in with a Catholic family who, in spite of their religious beliefs, encouraged her to get a divorce. Emma would always love George in spite of his treatment of her. The last word we have from George Bennett is a letter he wrote to Emma in April 1869. He had proven himself a scoundrel of the first order, but I can't help feeling a little sorry for him when I see that beautiful, precise handwriting when he says, "Oh, Emma, do not cast me from your heart forever. I know I have been wicked, very wicked, and abused you wrongfully, but I pray of you to forgive everything. Let the past be buried in oblivion, and think only of the future." She did keep him in her heart, but she did not forgive him. They were divorced a month later. Homestead. That summer of 1869, Emma went to live with her aunt and uncle, Jane and Charles Hyam, at Fort Hall, where she was employed baking bread. Nearby Hyam Peak would later be named after Charles, for those of you familiar with the area around Blackfoot, Idaho. Fort Hall was originally built by Nathaniel Wyeth in 1834 as a trading post. It was soon taken over by the Hudson Bay Company and operated until 1856. The military took over the site in 1869. Emma was there when the military Fort Hall was being built. By the time this photo was taken in 1871, Emma had moved on. That's the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone, camped in the foreground. More about them in a minute. At Fort Hall, Emma became acquainted with another former follower of Joseph Morris named Nels Just. He was staying with her Aunt Jane and Uncle Charles. For my own entertainment a couple of years ago, I colorized this photo of Nels, using skin and hair tones from his great-great-grandson, my son, Jared. Nels was a freighter who ran supplies back and forth between Corinne, Utah, and the Montana mines. One morning, while camped near what is now Firth, he found that his oxen had wandered off. He followed their tracks, which led him to a little hidden valley along the Blackfoot River. He got his oxen back and remembered that pretty little valley. With homesteading there in mind, Nels asked the 19-year-old divorcee to marry him. With a toddler now to care for, she saw the wisdom of it. She was very upfront with Nels, telling him she would probably never love him, but that she would make him a good wife. Nels and Emma traveled to Malad City, the county seat of what was then Oneida County, 88 miles away, in a covered wagon pulled by his oxen. It took them 8 days. They were married on November 9, 1870. This little sketch comes from the first edition of Letters of Long Ago, as do a couple of others in this presentation. We'll talk more about that book as we go along, but for now, it's enough to know that the sketch was drawn by the daughter of the infant son who rode along in that wagon with Nels and Emma to Malad. Mabel Bennett was the granddaughter of that scoundrel soldier. She would go on to be a noted artist whose work was collected by Hollywood celebrities as well as the Smithsonian. With winter closing in, Nels and Emma moved to the valley along the Blackfoot and constructed a dugout with a buffalo robe for a door. I'm not sure why Mabel chose to depict it in this sketch with a wooden door. Maybe it was a later improvement. By the way, the chapter title where this sketch serves as the heading is The House Beautiful. There's much more to tell. The book Letters of Long Ago has the complete story. Briefly, Nels and Emma raised boys and buried girls, for the most part, until their last child, Agnes, was born. It is from the writings of Agnes that we know Emma's story. The story is told as a series of letters from Emma to her father, George Thompson. Emma did write letters to her father in England, but they no longer exist. Agnes Just Reed used fictional letters as a literary device to tell her mother's story. Now, Emma was right there to review every page as it came off the typewriter when Agnes wrote Letters of Long Ago. Unfortunately, Emma passed away shortly before the book was published by Caxton Printers. I'd like to read two passages from the book. The first is about an encounter Emma had with a very famous man. The second is how she nearly destroyed her family. This is dated May 15th, 1871. The winter was uneventful, but the spring has been wonderful. We have had guests, distinguished guests from the big world itself. You see, there is a land to the northeast of us, perhaps 100 miles, that is considered marvelous for its scenic possibilities, and the government is sending a party of surveyors, chemists, etc., to pass judgment with a view to setting it aside for a national park. Well, this party happened to stop at our little cabin. There were representatives from all of the big eastern colleges, and then, besides, there were the Moran brothers. I think you must have heard of Thomas Moran, even as far away as England, for he is a wonderful nature artist, and his brother John is what I've heard you speak of as a bookmaker. He writes magazine articles. And those two remarkable men were interested in us and in our way of living. Think of it, Father. I took them into the cellar where I had been churning to give them a drink of fresh buttermilk, and while they drank and enjoyed it, I was smoothing the rolls of butter with my cedar paddle that Nels had whittled out for me with his pocket knife. I noticed the artist man paying special attention to the process, and finally he ventured rather apologetically, "Mrs. Just, would you mind telling me what you varnish your rolls of butter with that gives them such a glossy appearance?" I thought the man was making fun of me, or sport of me, as you would express it, but I looked into his face and saw that it was all candor. That is one of the happiest experiences of my life, for that man who knows everything to be ignorant of the lines that I know so well. I tried to make him understand that the smooth paddle and the fresh butter were all sufficient, but I think he is still rather bewildered. And do you know, since that day the art of butter making has taken on a new dignity. I always did like to do it, but now my cedar paddle keeps singing to me with every stroke. Even Thomas Moran cannot do this. Thomas Moran cannot do this. And before I know it, the butter is all finished, and I am ready to sing a different song to the washboard. Thomas Moran, of course, was a member of the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone in 1871. The expedition was camped nearby, and several members visited the Just cabin. Emma and Nels sold them some of their handiwork, some leather gloves and breeches. Family tradition has it that the breeches in this photo, taken by another famous man that went along on the expedition, William Henry Jackson, were made by Emma. One more passage from Letters of Long Ago. This one gives us a look at the occasional terror of pioneer life, and it illustrates the brutal honesty of Emma. Blackfoot River, Idaho Territory, September 14th, 1877. Dear Father, tell me, Father, is it a mark of insanity for one to wish to take his own life? My husband says it is, but I insist that it is perfectly sensible. So we shall expect you to cast the deciding vote. I've been on the point of killing my children and myself, that we might be spared a more terrible fate. And before you agree with Nels that my mind is becoming unbalanced, I want you to know how logical it all appears to me. I think I must have mentioned our fear of an Indian uprising when I wrote last. Well, with the coming of spring, our worst fears were confirmed, and the summer has been a season of terror. I often wonder if some of the newspaper reports reach even to where you are, and if you picture us, your very own, being burned to death in the little cabin as you read of a lonely habitation being destroyed. The Nez Perce tribes to the north of us, with Chief Joseph as leader, have been doing depredations of all descriptions, and each time we hear coming nearer and nearer to us. Albert Lyon, whom you remember from Soda Springs days, was captured by them out in the Birch Creek country, which is only 100 miles from here, and he barely escaped with his life. He was freighting with Green's outfit, and when the Indians came upon them, they took possession of the wagons and drivers, but assured them they meant no harm, just wanted to detain them so they could not give the alarm. After being held several days, Lion managed to give them the slip by dropping down into the wash, then following down the bed of the stream, and finally reached a cabin in time to save himself from a death of starvation. His fellow travelers were all killed, and the wagons burned before the savages moved camp. Some, who wish to promote a Christian attitude toward the red man, insist that it was because Lion betrayed the trust, but it seems to me he simply saved his own scalp. But to return to my own story. Nels has been putting up hay at Fort Hall the greater part of the summer, often staying away overnight. Brooding as I did, I could not sleep when alone, and I dared not make a light, for it would only serve as a target for some stealthy redskin, so all night my imagination ran riot. I would see through the windows bushes and stumps that were familiar to me by daylight, but by night they took the form of a crouching savage, of which there were a million more just behind the shadows surrounding the cabin. Night after night I spent in that way, and day after day I milked the cows and made the butter with my head hidden away in an old slat sunbonnet, lest the children might discover my changing expressions. When Nels came home, he brought papers with vivid descriptions of the path of terror the Indians were leaving in their wake. When Nels came home, he brought papers with vivid descriptions of the path of terror the Indians were leaving in their wake. And I felt positive that it was only a matter of time until they would join our own tribes here and complete the destruction of the white race in southern Idaho. The fall days began to come on when a heavy haze hung over everything, sometimes poetically called Indian summer. But that one word has taken the poetry out of everything for me this summer. Nels had not been home for several days, and the desperation of continued loneliness was upon me, when toward evening the children came rushing in from their play to say there was a fire on the hill south of us. I tried to assure them that it was just something that looked like a fire, but I knew too well that it was a fire, a signal fire that one band makes to let the others be in readiness for a celebration. That night I was almost frantic, and while the children slept, I made up my mind what I must do to save them. I resolved never to let them be mutilated by savage fingers before my very eyes. No, no, I had read of such cases, and mine should never suffer so, while I was held captive, perhaps to bear other children by the savage brute that had murdered mine. I had given existence to mine. Now at such a crisis it was my right to take it from them. I would drown the older ones one by one, then take the baby in my arms and go in beside them. To try to hide would be useless. The baby would cry, and we would be found and tortured more for trying to deceive them. So at the first intimation of their approach, we would find our only safety in the river so near at hand. I felt perfectly sure that the end was near. The signal fire had been the culminating event in the tragedy. But after the children had eaten the breakfast, which I was unable to taste, I went on with the milking through force of habit, I suppose. I'd milk a cow, then go up the hill to strain my eyes for the coming of the enemy. At last I saw what I expected to see, a dust, or was it a smoke? In either case it meant the same. It was just at the point where the shoemakers live, and if it were dust, the Indians were reaching there. If smoke, they had been there, and were leaving. There was no time to lose. I called my poor terror-stricken babies around me and told them we must all drown together. If the older ones held any differences of opinion, they knew their mother too well to express them. So with a board in my hand on which was to be scribbled an explanation to Nels, we started to the river. Like Lot's wife, I turned once to look back, and the cause of the dust I had seen was in plain view. My husband. I have heard of the interventions of Providence, and this must be an illustration, for in 10 minutes more he would have been a man without a family. He called me crazy, and said he would never trust me alone, and I'm not sure that I blame him. The solitude must be getting on my nerves. I need a neighbor. I need companionship. I never seem to feel lonesome, for I'm always busy, but I have too much of my own society. If you're familiar with the circumstances of the Nez Perce War, you know there was another side to the story, and that Joseph was actually a peace-thirsty chief. But where Emma was sitting, he scared her nearly to death. So, what happened to the people you've learned about today? Joseph Morris, as we know, was killed by a bullet from Robert Burton's gun in June of 1862. But that did not kill the Church of the Firstborn. It struggled along for almost 100 years before perishing with the death of its last member in the 1950s. The church was strongest in Deer Lodge, Montana. These are pictures of the last Morrisite church. It still stands in Deer Lodge, though it has been shuttered for more than 50 years. The Morrisite tradition of prophecy continued in its early years. The church's second leader, George Williams, who called himself the Prophet Canaan, let the world know that Deer Lodge, Montana, would be where Jesus would return to earth. There is no indication that ever happened, but it fit nicely with some of the teachings of the Baha'i faith, which also tagged Deer Lodge as a holy site and referenced the teachings of Canaan. And here's a coincidence that I find interesting. The name Joseph Morris is probably not that unusual, but if you Google it today, the first entries you're going to come up with are for a Joseph Morris who is a televangelist. He is particularly interested in the imminent apocalypse and the return of Christ to earth. What goes around comes around, I guess. But back to what happened to some of our players. What about Robert Burton, the leader of the Mormon militia? Well, in 1879, he stood trial for killings that occurred by his hand at Kington Fort, and his fate was decided by none other than Emma Thompson Just. Here's how it was described in letters of long ago. Blackfoot River, Idaho Territory, March 8, 1879. My dear father, here I have been so busy relating the details of family life that I've forgotten to mention the coming of the railroad. When we settled here, my husband always said there would be a railroad in 10 years, and his prophecy has been fulfilled in about 7, as it reached the little burg of Blackfoot, 15 miles from us, sometime during December. Now I've had a ride on the steam car, would you believe it? And a visit to the city of Zion, the Zion that you brought my mother 6,000 miles to see. It is very changed since I saw it last in the 60s. But I took little note of its improvements, for my mind was too much engrossed in the 3-month-old baby in my arms, and in the fact that I was the star witness in a murder trial. Can you imagine it, Father? Your little M taking such a part in the affairs of men. I did not realize that my testimony was of such vital importance until it was all over. Then the remark of the attorney was heard to the effect that I was the one witness they feared. But wait. I have not told you. One cold night in February, a very unusual-looking man appeared at the door, and after making several inquiries, drew out the subpoena that called me as a witness on the trial of Robert T. Burton, being held on a charge of murder in Salt Lake. In the years of our trials of homesteading, I've tried to forget the details most unpleasant of all our early experiences, the Mormon-Morrisite War. As I have grown more mature in judgment, I've realized that we poor misguided Morrisites were very much at fault, for in defying the sheriff's posse as we did, we were really defying our government. For even though the posse was formed from the pillars of the Mormon Church, they were vested with the authority from Washington, and we should not have tried to evade arrest. But this is all looking backward, and I must proceed with my adventure. Of course, first of all, I protested that I could not leave my family, but Nels said it was my duty to go, and he felt sure that my memory could not fail to bring the guilty to justice. So I went, but with a sinking heart. I regretted to leave my 4 boys that I had never been away from overnight. I regretted to take my tiny infant among people where might lurk the germs of every dread disease, and I regretted most of all going among the Mormon people. They say a burnt child dreads the fire, so I guess a child that has been shot at cannot help fearing the hand that pulled the trigger. Every foot of the way we traveled, I expected the train would be blown off the track, for it carried a number of witnesses, or I expected we would be burned in the courtroom, anything to wreak the Mormon vengeance as I had known it. But the Mormons are changed since those days, Father. They are a different people. Still, frightened as I was, when I sat in the witness chair, the old scenes came back to me as vividly as if they had occurred but yesterday. I saw the hills blackened by the approaching enemy, heard the bugle call, our own beloved Morrisite call, that assembled us in the Bowery, and I knew again with what joy and trust I went forth, expecting to be delivered by the hand of the Almighty. Then I saw a cannonball come rushing through that humble gathering, fired by the waiting hordes on the hillside, and two of our trusting Morrisites lying dead in the Bowery. Yes, I saw it all, Father, and told them as only one who had seen could ever tell it. And the Mormons assembled there in the name of the law began to fear me just as I had at first feared them. I told them of the babe in its mother's arms falling to the ground at the boom of the first cannon, and before the firing ceased, falling again when its second protector was killed. I told them of a woman, then in their city, who had lost the entire lower part of her face when the first ball was fired into that defenseless gathering of men, women, and children. I told them of the hoisting of the white flag by our terror-stricken band, and of the Mormon warriors, less heeding than any savage tribe of the wilderness, continuing to fire, killing 4 right under the flag of truce. I told them how on the second day I'd gone skipping across the public square in childish fearlessness, with cannons to the right of me, cannons to the left of me, to find my mother huddled in the cellar under our house, white as in death, marking the number of cannons fired with a stick in the dirt. She had counted 75 that one day. Oh, Father, I can see her always, poor suffering creature, as she took me in her arms, saying, "Thank God, my child, you are safe." I looked at her in childish eagerness and dismay, saying, "Why, Mother, is your faith weakening? God will punish these foolish destroyers." But she only hugged me closer, sobbing, "My child, bullets will kill." I told them how after 3 days of almost continuous firing, they had surrounded us, taking our men prisoners, after having killed our beloved prophet Joseph Morris. I told them how in the struggle that followed his fall, you stood by the lifeless form of the prophet and said to the Mormon that had once posed as our friend, "You've killed him, now you better kill me," and of his attempt to shoot you had his gun not refused to obey his will. Then I told them of the gentle creature Mrs. Bowman, who came forth during the struggle calling one of the leaders a bloodthirsty wretch. I told them how before my childish eyes the fiend exclaimed, "No woman shall call me that and live," and suiting the action to the word, he shot her down. And so after all these years I was the instrument to avenge these wrongs to what mild extent it could ever be done. I was in the witness chair, and my word would send to the gallows the murderer of that poor woman. After questioning me sufficiently, they asked me to look around the courtroom and see if I recognized anyone. Did I? Well, I certainly did, just as I would recognize you, my own father, after all these years of separation. There he sat with his same flowing beard and gleaming eyes. His face had been the one thing that I could see distinctly all during my examination, as it had looked when I saw him years before, and as it looked then. I think it had really served to bring the scenes before me more vividly as I recounted the details, particularly when it had come to the point of his pulling me roughly away from the body of Joseph Morris, just after I had seen him slay Mrs. Bowman. But at this point, my memory only served to set him free. You, Father, no doubt would have remembered correctly, but the 2 leaders, Stoddard and Burton, had always been pointed out to me together, and just as sometimes will occur, I had transposed the names. And the guilty man that I saw before me was the one I had always believed to be Stoddard. It so happened that the man Stoddard had been dead a good many years. So my testimony simply laid all the crimes onto the dead man and set free the criminal before me. So ignorant was I of courts and councils, and so dependent upon my childish recollections, that it never occurred to me there was any chance for mistake until I had killed my own evidence. It is important to note that there was another witness at that trial that you'll remember, Mary Christopherson Anderson, that brave woman who perhaps suffered the most of all the survivors of the Morrisite War, told her story on the witness stand, too. Moving on with our epilogue, Peter Anderson Just, the father of Nels Just, spent some years with other sons in Nebraska and some in Deer Lodge, Montana, where he remained one of the faithful Morrisites. He lived with Nels and Emma in the last years of his life and probably helped build their brick home. He was a brick mason. Peter died in 1891 and is buried in the little pioneer cemetery on the hill above the Just home. Karen Marie Just spent most of her life in Nebraska with her other sons. After Peter's death, she did spend some time with Nels and Emma Just in Idaho. And I have to tell the strangest little story about her and about Emma's father, George Thompson. They found themselves both without spouses, so decided to get married. The following story appeared in the Salt Lake Tribune. We don't know the date of the article, though the incident it describes would probably have been about 1892. Quoting from the article, "My mother's father and my father's mother, having lost their mates, came here to spend their later years," recounts Mrs. Agnes Just Reed, author of 2 books, Letters of Long Ago, a story of her mother's pioneer experiences, and Rugged Rhymes, verse. "My father built a cottage, 2 bedrooms with a living room between for them. No kitchen because they ate with our family. Well, one day my mother found the old man hitching his horse to a cart. Asked where he was going, he only smiled. But my grandmother, silver-haired and so fat you couldn't tell whether she was sitting or standing, edged over, confided they were off to a Mormon bishop at Basalt to be married. The elderly newlyweds-to-be rattled out of the farmyard while Mrs. Reed's mother relayed the news to her husband. Neither somehow showed any enthusiasm. Within an hour, horse on dead run, the cart hurtled back into the yard. Disgruntled is a shallow word for the way the fair-complexioned, bobbed-haired bride-to-be jumped unaided from the high-spring seat to the ground. It seems after the couple had trotted along the dusty road for a while, Karen Marie, thinking pleasantly of the immediate future, had remarked that youngsters at the ranch, Mrs. Reed's brothers, would be out to greet them upon return with cowbells. "Well, I hope not, Karen," replied Grandfather Thompson, formerly a shopkeeper in England. "Where I came from, nothing but the lowest scum of the earth took part in such demonstrations." That comment apparently didn't sit well with Karen, and instantly the marriage was off. Karen Marie died in 1908 at the age of 85 and is buried near Redbird, Nebraska. George Thompson, as fate would have it, would not be claimed by old age. George held several leadership roles in the Church of the Firstborn in its early years and spent much time in England trying to recruit new members. But it was Idaho where he died. He and his sister, Jane Hyam, were out for a drive in a wagon when their team bolted. They hit a bridge abutment and were both thrown into a canal near Ryrie. Both survived for a time in much misery, but they died within 24 hours of the accident. And finally, what about Nels and Emma Just? After spending the winter of 1870 in a dugout, Nels and Emma built a little log house, then replaced that with a 2-bedroom framed home. In 1887, they completed their 4th home, made of brick fired on site. It still stands today. Nels Just became a successful rancher. He started the bank and the mill in Shelley, Idaho. He ran the canal company that dug the Idaho Canal, which was the first to bring irrigation water to thousands of acres of farmland in eastern Idaho. He died in a Salt Lake City hospital where he was being treated for pneumonia. Nels was 65. His body rests in the historic cemetery on the hill above the house he built along the Blackfoot River. Emma lived a long, productive life. She served as postmistress for a dozen years or so, working out of her home along the Blackfoot River, serving the scattered little community of ranches called Presto. She never stopped cooking, cleaning, or sewing. We have her diaries from the First World War, in which she talks frequently of sewing blankets for the troops. Emma rode horses all of her life. She's pictured here on a side saddle. The saddle is occasionally on display at the Idaho State Historical Museum in Boise. This is probably the last photo taken of Emma. Fittingly, it is in front of the house she and Nels lived in for so many years. That's Emma on the left in the scarf. The picture was taken about 1923, which was the year she passed away at age 73. Although some of the early graves in the family cemetery had wooden markers, and I'm old enough to remember seeing a few of them, they've all turned to dust by now. A few years ago, we put up this memorial to mark those buried there. I want to wrap up with just a little bit about Emma's only daughter, Agnes Just Reed. Agnes Just married Robert Reed in 1906. They had 5 boys, most of whom were genuine cowboys, who ended up on the original homestead or with nearby ranches of their own. Agnes was a well-known regional writer in her time. She published several books of poetry and wrote a weekly column in the Blackfoot newspaper for more than 40 years. She is best known for the book about her mother's life, Letters of Long Ago. Agnes Just Reed passed away in 1976. After she died, the family found a carbon copy of an old manuscript that told the story of her mother's early life from 1863 to 1870, which encompassed her time at Morristown and her first marriage and divorce. It used the same literary device of letters from the United States to England, but this time not to her father, to her cousin Lucy instead. The family published that manuscript under the title The Lost Letters in 2006 in a matching volume to the 4th edition of Letters of Long Ago. That concludes the presentation. Again, for those interested in further study, I recommend the books Joseph Morris and the Saga of the Morrisites Revisited by Dr. C. Leroy Anderson and Letters of Long Ago by Agnes Just Reed. Both are readily available on Amazon.